Hello and welcome to Nothing But the Truth. As Prime Minister Modi completes his first month in office, has he made an impressive start, or is that just unjustified post-electoral euphoria? That's the key issue I shall discuss today with one of India's foremost authors and commentators, Mukul Kesavan. Mukul Kesavan, let's start with that question. Many people believe Mr. Modi has actually made an impressive start. Without going into specifics at this stage, do you agree with that impression, or do you think it's unjustified post-electoral euphoria?
Well, I think some part of it is the classic honeymoon. We are a parliamentary democracy. We like the thought that leaders with a large mandate should take office in a glow of good feeling. So some part of it is that, but not all of it. I think Mr. Modi has gone out of his way to, at least rhetorically, make inclusive. I think there is a sense in which many people who saw him as a Hindutvadi strongman who metaphorically doesn't take prisoners were relieved.
Let's then begin by going into details with what the Prime Minister has said before we come afterwards to talk about the decisions he's taken. Now, in his inaugural speech in the Lok Sabha, the Prime Minister looked across at the opposition and said, "Whatever be the numbers here, I do not want to move ahead without you. Without your support, my mandate is incomplete. So I will seek your support and guidance as we proceed." Do you see that as the beginning of a new consensual approach in politics, or simply clever strategy because he doesn't have the numbers in the Rajya Sabha?
Well, it's something to do with the Rajya Sabha numbers, because he clearly has lots of legislation to pass and he just doesn't have the seats in the Rajya Sabha. He will, though, once provincial elections begin to happen.
Except that it may not take 2 years or even 3 years before he does.
This is true. But this is not the whole story. I think there is a very real sense in which Mr. Modi is self-conscious about the fact that he is a divisive and polarizing figure. And therefore, there is no cost, there's no downside to being inclusive in your rhetoric. And I think he's done this. I think he's done this intelligently and to serve him well.
The question is it just rhetoric, or does he actually mean it? Because Congress turns around and says that this so-called consensual approach is undermined, or at least contradicted, by the fact that the BJP is determined to deny the Congress party the status of official leader of the opposition in the Lok Sabha. Do you agree with that Congress complaint, or do you think because they don't have the numbers, they themselves can't make that claim?
You know, I think in this case, Mr. Modi has right on his side. You know, there is a threshold which a party has to pass to automatically qualify as the leader of the opposition, or appoint the leader of the opposition. We forget, Karan, that there was a time when India didn't have formal leaders of the opposition. This was the time when the Congress system worked in its full glory. So if they don't actually procedurally make that threshold, it's reasonable for the government to be undecided, at any rate, as to whether they should extend to them recognition as the principal party of the opposition.
So this is one instance where, even though at the moment it's rhetoric and we want to see proof, this is welcome rhetoric about reaching out to the opposition.
I think it is. It's certainly intelligent rhetoric.
Let's then come to a second element, or a second part of that inaugural speech in the Lok Sabha, when he said some pretty surprising things about Muslims. He said, "We need focused activity to change the lives of Muslims. They cannot be left behind in development. We will have to bring such programs. I do not view such programs within the prism of appeasement." Would you accept that that is a dramatic change from the sort of language that he used up till now? He's no longer talking about the burqa of secularism. He's no longer criticizing the Sattar Commission for appeasement.
I think this part of what he said is genuinely interesting. It's genuinely interesting because Prime Minister Modi, and indeed candidate Modi, have been very careful. Up to now, Mr. Modi hasn't actually specifically addressed Muslims as a community. In fact, he's made it a point of honor of saying that he stands, I think the slogan is a development for all, and it's invariably spoilt by that tagged on ending, appeasement of none. This seems to be a break from that particular slogan. He's actually mentioned the unmentionable M word, which in this case is Muslims. He has said that he intends to focus on Muslims. Now, what's interesting is, what does this targeted focus actually mean? Does it, for example, mean Mr. Modi cleaning up, in inverted commas, madrasas?
It does actually, because he's talked about a national madrasa modernization policy in the president's address.
Yes. Well, if it means cleaning up madrasas, in his view, this is both interesting and worrying, because the thought of Mr. Modi as a social engineer, re-engineering the institutions of Indian Muslims, I imagine would be something that many people would approach warily.
Because that would look and sound like interference.
Yes, on the other hand, we know that Mr. Modi has an allergy to notions of preferences and quotas based on caste and community. So I can't see him going there. Apart from madrasas, I'm not sure what he means by this.
Let me ask you two critical questions. First of all, when he says this is not appeasement, is he actually giving up the concept of appeasement, which was so critical to the way he looked at Muslims, or is he now questioning what appeasement amounts to?
You know, I think one of the problems with trying to read the tea leaves as far as the Modi Sarkar is concerned is that it's done so little that it's hard to actually say. I would merely say that during his campaign, Mr. Modi on several occasions made pronouncements that were less than benign as far as Muslims were concerned. And certainly some of his proxies, like Mr. Amit Shah, made explicitly majoritarian statements. So I think the jury is out on this one. Whether Mr. Modi has given up the category of appeasement or whether he hasn't, it's too early to tell.
Now, clearly, Mr. Modi, when he said this, was reaching out to India's 140 million Muslims. But what do you make of the fact that when a techie of 28 years old in Pune was brutally battered to death simply because he had a beard and was mistaken for a Muslim, the Prime Minister took a long, long time before he spoke out about it, and then he only did it en passant and very briefly?
You know, let me just say that the death of Mohsin Sheikh, who was this so-called techie in Pune, was a genuine tragedy because he was essentially killed because he looked Muslim. He was wearing a beard. There were a group of hoodlums on motorcycles looking for vengeance for some Facebook post. He looked Muslim and they killed him. In many ways, Mohsin Sheikh should have been the poster boy of the kind of India that Mr. Modi wants to bring into existence. He was a Muslim. He was from an unprivileged background. He was socially mobile. He had made himself technically educated. He was a dutiful son, and he died because he was visibly Muslim. This would have been, in a sense, a perfect opportunity for Mr. Modi to explicitly disavow this kind of violence on behalf, not just of his government, on behalf of Indian society generally. But most importantly, I think what was worrying is that Mr. Modi did not publicly pull up the BJP MP from Pune, Mr. Shirole, I think his name is, who actually publicly said something to the effect that some repercussions are inevitable when things like this go up on Facebook.
If I understand you correctly, what you're suggesting is this was a golden opportunity for the Prime Minister to distance himself from the extremist elements of his own support and send out a message about himself which should have clarified his stand on Muslims and perhaps removed some of the doubts Muslims have about him. It was an opportunity that he should have used in his own self-interest but failed to do so.
I think he should have. He didn't, in fact, have to make an explicit statement like to this effect. He could have merely pulled up his party's MP for saying something that seems to be complicit with majoritarianism.
Now, there was a third element of that speech in the Lok Sabha when the Prime Minister spoke not just with passion but at considerable length about the need for respect for women and his personal abhorrence of rape. And yet, when shortly thereafter one of his ministers, Nehal Chand Megwal, was accused of rape, not only did the Prime Minister not move to remove him from government, but so far he hasn't said anything about the matter at all. Do you find that silence, that lack of action, perplexing, perhaps even a little disturbing?
Well, let's briefly take the BJP's defense of this inaction. I think the defense basically is that since the lower courts allowed the police's closure report was fine, in a sense, this person has no case to answer. But the optics of this are terrible. Here you have a court which has, in a sense, issued a summons to many people, including this minister, asking him why he shouldn't be persecuted on the basis of this woman's complaint. And we have BJP representatives on television every day saying it's a case of mistaken identity, the woman is complicit in some kind of fraud. Coming in the wake of the dreadful assaults upon women that have happened in this country, this just seems the wrong tack to take. Why has Mr. Modi not spoken? My sense is that Mr. Modi doesn't like to be pushed into taking actions on account of public or media pressure.
Is that the answer, or is it that perhaps Mr. Modi over here, through his silence, through his lack of action, is revealing, unintentionally of course, a certain ambiguity, dare I say it, even a certain hypocrisy in his position, or at least in his rhetoric?
Well, let me just say that in the matter of having people in government who are less than savory or who have charges against them that are serious, Mr. Modi has some form. So, for example, there's Mr. Balian, Mr. Sanjeev Balian, who is elected from Muzaffarnagar.
But to be honest, there were people of that character also in UPA governments.
It's
a tradition in India.
I'm suggesting to you, though, that in the wake of a major communal incident in Muzaffarnagar, to actually have as your Minister of Agriculture one of the accused in those disturbances, speaks of a kind of stubbornness in the matter of political choice. This is not I just want to say that as Chief Minister, Mr. Modi had within his cabinet Maya Kudnani, who was the Minister of Child and Women's Welfare, who was later found culpable of
You're suggesting there's a certain track record of inappropriate people in government who Mr. Modi continues to retain, even though public opinion and his own self-interest would suggest that he should not only distance himself, but drop them.
Let me say that Mr. Modi's greatest political triumph has been, in a sense, to wait out the public controversy and the media criticism about, say, the 2002 events. It may just be that he has learnt from this the lesson that you can ride out controversy and emerge from it looking your own man. So maybe this is in play.
And that probably suggests that he thinks he can ride out the controversy around Make White, and you may well be right. There was a fourth element in that speech that he made to the Lok Sabha when he spoke about centre-state relations, and he spoke about the sort of relationship he wants with chief ministers. And there he said, we cannot have a big brother attitude. We have to treat all states as equal. PM and CMs will have to work as a team. And then he added, the states have their own problems and strengths. We have to develop a model to understand their problems. Do you get there a hint, maybe more than just a hint, that we are seeing a possible rebalancing of Indian federalism, a moving away from the Congress approach, which put the centre first and saw the states as subordinate? Mr. Modi, as a former chief minister, is determined to correct that balance and give the states a fair share of power.
I think what we are seeing is more precisely an acknowledgement of the already changed balance in centre-state relations. I think what we've seen politically over the last 20 years, one of the big stories has been the increasing power of provincial satraps and strongmen. You know, whether it's Orissa, or whether it's Bengal, or whether it's Tamil Nadu, you have strong political politicians, strong provincial politicians. Mr. Modi is one such. He knows the potential of provincial power. The BJP also has the advantage of not having a dynastic high command, and it has learnt to accommodate provincial chieftains within the political systems that it runs.
Congress never learned to do that after Indira Gandhi.
That's right.
So he's actually going back to a relationship that the centre had with the states when Nehru was Prime Minister, and Congress had regional satraps who were actually powerful in their own right. We're going back to that in some shape and form, and moving away from the centralization and the centre-first attitude that you saw under Indira and certainly under Rajiv Gandhi and his successors.
I think we are. Mr. Modi is not one of BJP's pan-Indian politicians bred in Delhi. You know, he's not Mr. Jaitley, he's not Ms. Sushma Swaraj. He is a provincial chief minister who has captured power in the centre, and I think that's marked him and the way in which he deals with other states.
Let's now move away from the things that Mr. Modi has said, but they were no doubt important things for us to analyze, and come to some of the decisions his government has taken. First, the decision to nudge UPA-appointed governors by getting the Home Secretary to ring them, ignoring the fact that they are constitutional authorities, and in fact, in a sense, suggesting that a secretary can ring them as if they were minions and tell them to leave. Do you think this whole issue should have been better handled, and that it's been somewhat badly, poorly, ineptly handled?
I think it's been inelegantly handled, but I have to say that on the substance of this, my sympathies are in this case with Mr. Modi. Many of these governors, being political appointees, often being political appointees who've been active politicians, should in fact have given in their resignation.
So this is the right decision, but handled the wrong way.
I think poorly handled, yes.
How bad is the handling, or is it excusable?
Let me say that it's unlikely to damage Mr. Modi's prime ministership.
So this is a question mark that won't last for very long?
I don't think so.
What about the advisory sent out by the Home Ministry to bureaucrats and civil servants that communication on the social media should be in Hindi? It's aroused concern in Tamil Nadu, where both the DMK and the AIADMK have complained, but it's also aroused a certain concern about people who believe that Hindi is not the automatic language of every Indian. Many Indians prefer their own mother tongues, many others can only talk in English to each other. Was this an issue where Mr. Modi should have been a lot more careful and hesitant, and the government has perhaps behaved a bit like a bull in a china shop?
I think two things. One of the reasons I think Mr. Modi has done this is because it's interesting that he conducted his campaign entirely in Hindi right across the country and won a very handsome mandate. So I think he's encouraged by the fact that India is not, he thinks India is not the country it was 40 years ago when the whole language question was so volatile. But I think this is a fight much too early to pick. Why would you, in a sense, want to remind people of the previous avatar of the BJP, the Janasangh, which used to go Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan, in the first few weeks of your prime ministership?
He's got his timing wrong here.
I think he's got his timing wrong. I think it's an initiative he could have pushed further down the road. As it is, you have people like Chief Minister Jayalalitha already with her hackles up, having to publicly denounce this.
And Jayalalitha is a potential friend he wants on his side,
That's right.
not to annoy and offend. Let's then come to something that's not a decision as yet, but it's a clear harbinger of what is to come. Last weekend, the Prime Minister said that, in fact, difficult, tough decisions were needed to tackle the economy, and he wouldn't shy away from them, even if they damaged his popularity. Do you see that as a firm sign of resolve, and very different from the uncertainty and the ad hoc nature of the UPA, or do you simply see it as rhetoric?
I don't see it as rhetoric at all. I think we have a genuinely right-of-centre government. There's also a sense in which there's a great deal of continuity in what Dr. Manmohan Singh would have wanted to do in the economic sphere and what Mr. Modi plans to do. Mr. Manmohan Singh was often hamstrung by what could be described as the left wing of the Congress party, represented by Mrs. Sonia Gandhi. Mr. Modi has no such restraints. So I think as far as labour laws are concerned, as far as fuel subsidies are concerned, as far as a stricter budget is concerned, I think we will actually see him walk the talk.
So here, this is, in your eyes, both transparency, the Prime Minister indicating in advance what he wants to do and being honest, and also firm resolve.
Yes, I think he sees himself as an economic modernizer on the Gujarat model, and he plans to follow that through. He thinks it's a winning model.
Let's then take a break at that point. When I come back, I want to turn and talk about the Prime Minister's style and his personality, because believe it or not, they too have been in the news. And then eventually ask you to sum up the Prime Minister and tell me, with which international leader do you think he's best compared as a way of trying to understand him? Mukul Kesavan. Mukul Kesavan, let's come to Mr. Modi's style and what it reveals of his personality. Many people believe he's made the transition from candidate to Prime Minister with comfortable ease. Some even think he's begun to behave prime ministerially almost from the word go. Would you agree with that view?
Well, I think there is a contrast between Mr. Modi, the campaigner, and Mr. Modi, the Prime Minister. I think Mr. Jairam Ramesh commented on this difference, saying that rhetorically, the Prime Minister seems much less combative than the campaigner.
Shashi Tharoor said something similar too.
Shashi Tharoor said something similar. My sense is that working out who Mr. Modi is has become a little like Kremlinology, where you're constantly looking for signs to see if the combative chief minister has become a statesperson.
Many people say that they're impressed with what they call his quiet dignity, the fact that he's not arrogant, the fact that he's not boorish, the fact that he's not hogging the headlines or even the headlights. Are you surprised by that as well, or do you think that's just a reflection of the fact that maybe we didn't know Mr. Modi that well?
Well, I'm not surprised simply because Mr. Modi currently owns the headlines. He'd be silly to go hunting after them because they come to him without the slightest effort.
And therefore, as Prime Minister, any recalcitrance that he shows would always come up as praiseworthy.
I'm not sure that any recalcitrance he shows will come across as praiseworthy, but merely in a sense, adopting a statesman like Mian will go down very well, at least at the beginning.
People say no matter what the Prime Minister says, no matter what he does, the one thing that always comes through is his determination to succeed. It seems so apparent to many people. In your eyes, is that healthy ambition or cause for a little bit of concern?
Well, compared with the previous regime, where Mr. Manmohan Singh was stymied in a kind of inertia, any reasonable display of purposefulness will come across as a refreshing change. And I think there is a sense in which Mr. Modi gives off a sense of urgency. Whether he certainly means to galvanize this leviathan, the state, which is a good thing in itself. Whether this is welcome or a cause for worry depends largely on what he actually does with this sense of urgency.
And therefore, time will tell.
Time will tell.
Now, finally, and this may sound a bit odd, his sartorial style. Newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post have complimented him. They've actually said that he's set a new style. Do you believe that, or do you think here journalists are being a little credulous?
Well, I have to say that in this particular case, I prefer the sartorial style of his predecessor, which is virtually a uniform. I find Mr. Modi's sartorial style somewhat studied and overproduced. But that's just a personal preference.
Do you think he's striving for effect and striving a little too hard?
I think there's a sense in which Mr. Modi is deeply self-aware of how he comes across and how he wants to look.
You mean a little bit of the element of the peacock?
Well, that's not for me to say.
Let's try and sum up Mr. Modi. People often try and classify individuals as a way of understanding them. If you were to try and compare Mr. Modi to an international leader so that you get a better understanding of the sort of person, the sort of Prime Minister he is, who would you compare Mr. Modi with?
Well, Mr. Modi has been compared in the press from, everyone to Milosevic to the Prime Minister of Japan, Prime Minister Abe. In my mind, though, the person he's closest to is the Turkish Prime Minister, Mr. Erdogan. Both of them represent broadly communitarian parties. The difference here is that Mr. Erdogan founded his own party while Mr. Modi has to remake one that he inherited. Both of them, in a sense, are economic modernizers, people with a strong authoritarian streak. The hopeful thing in this case is that Mr. Erdogan, despite his many faults, managed to create a kind of modus vivendi with two important minorities within Turkey, the Kurds on the one hand, and the Armenians. I think just this April, there was a kind of semi-apology he issued for the notorious genocide of Armenians. So I think if there is a political leader who is a kind of template for Mr. Modi, it's Mr. Erdogan.
You're also suggesting by implication that Mr. Modi could learn a lesson from the way Mr. Erdogan apologized to the Armenians and perhaps use that as some way of reaching out to the Muslims and overcoming whatever hesitation they have of him.
I'd certainly hope so.
But Mr. Erdogan was also responsible for some pretty brutal handling of public protests, and he got a lot of criticism for that both last year and earlier this year. Are you a little worried that if there are similar public protests, Mr. Modi could be equally brutal?
Well, I am. I think there was a public protest, for example, near Jantar Mantar, where demonstrators were in fact roughed up. I don't know whether this was very early in the government. I don't know whether it's routine police brutality or whether it's an indication of how Mr. Modi's government will behave. But I certainly think that in terms of economic liberalization, when you try and acquire land, when you try and deal with displaced people, when you raise the height of a dam, and you have protests, how the government will react will be interesting.
I want to end it there, but one simple last question. What do you think is the most important pitfall over the next 4 years and 11 months that the Prime Minister should be very wary of? Just one.
Yeah, well, it's hard to pick one, but if I can pick two, I'll just say one, should the economic resurgence not happen, the biggest pitfall would be if he defaults to a more majoritarian agenda. And two, and this is important simply because of 2002, should there, God forbid, be an episode of sectarian violence, how the state actually deals with it would be crucial.
He needs to be a very different man as Prime Minister compared to the image we had of him as Chief Minister.
I think he does.
Mukul Kesavan, a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.